6 years ago. Six years ago, I was inspired by what ended up becoming one of my favorite games of all time. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. All of that was at a different time of my life. I was in my final year of high school, the Nintendo Switch was a month away, and I was at a very different skill level with my art. Since then, I've graduated from college with a Bachelor of Arts, made many new friends and relationships, and improved a lot from where I was, and I've still got much more progress to make. Not only that, but the sequel to Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, is scheduled to release this week. What impeccable and coincidental timing. Looking back, that brush that I created for Paint Tool SAI and Photoshop is probably one of my biggest achievements. Why it stands out amongst having my artwork showcased in an exhibit in Japan and China, or graduating from college, is because there are hundreds of people that downloaded the previous versions of this brush. Hundreds of people that saw what I created and intended to share with them, and they probably used it. I would say that means I've impacted the creation of other people's art. To me, that's amazing. However, there are many issues I have with my previous work and efforts. First off, I've never seen anyone's creations with it other than my own. Not only that, but I don't know if many of the people who have downloaded my brushes have ever seen my art. And finally, the presentation of what could be done with this brush is absolutely horrible. There's a lack of skillful, intentional brushstrokes, conveyance and enhancement of form, and treating the work like an actual painting, which I'd say the Breath of the Wild character illustrations are. So, this is the new brush, in my creative process for it. If you want to bypass all of this stuff and just download the brush set, the link is in the description below. Otherwise, let's move forward. We've got our goal in mind, what I'm aiming to do, creating this brush of course. Let's get to the first step, research and observation. I've already had a lot saved over the years, but I need to pile together all of the promotional artwork for both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which at the timing of creation, the latter only had the game's cover art and artwork of Link and Zelda. Through my examination, there were several things that I took note of that split into two categories: the intent of the work, and then the goals of the art style itself. These are what I had to keep in mind, pick out and dictate to myself to consider with the brush's creation. For instance, we'll begin with the intent of the work, or works that are all part of the Wild promotional material. There are some illustrations that are paintings, or at least feel like they're just paintings. The colors and forms are together, not separated by lines meant to enclose one shape, object, or part of the body from one another. And then there are illustrations that do feature lines, sketches, line art, whatever you like to call it, amongst the colors and in between the forms. The distinction of what we're trying to create is important, and I think this image of Link and Zelda holding the Master Sword captures that there is work needed for both. Paintings don't always just happen. While we do have experimentation and unintentional actions that lead to amazing results, there's understanding and placing of what's going to be drawn, then allow for the painting to be built on top of that. Illustrators such as myself, and perhaps the you watching, need to establish this guide in clear detail, breaking down each piece before we simply jump in. And there's nothing wrong with that. Moving forward, there is a difference in the focus of detail amidst these illustrations. For instance, while the illustration of Link and Zelda doesn't seem to feature as many details, yes, I'm foreshadowing, there are other illustrations that do in a literal sense. If we examine Champion Mipha and how she's captured between her group illustration with the other champions and her solo illustration, we can directly see a difference in design focus and painting style. As the group illustration prominently features line art, the color that would follow from each stroke is bound within. Moving to the colors at hand, the lighting built upon the colors leads towards a white. Finally, the shape and form of her jewelry and clothing are enclosed. The depth and the curvature of their surfaces intend to be distinctly pointed out by the lines that separate them, with each one meant to be visible. Now, let's compare that to Mipha's solo illustration. The usage of line art is minimal to none, allowing the strokes of color to build the form on their own. This also extends to the jewelry, defining themselves by their color and the lighting that would capture around their surfaces. The lighting, although also leading into a white color, leads the starting colors towards more saturation before being fully illuminated. Finally, the jewelry and clothing dressing the subject is present, but is not portrayed in a way that gives a depiction of each curve, indent, or intended size. Take a look. We can compare the size of the blue jewel within Mipha's headpiece or the band that is around her waist and how different their depictions are. Not exactly the same, right? Our third focus is also our most important when it comes to understanding and recreating this art style: when to take a breath. If we go back to the illustration of Link and Zelda holding the Master Sword, while there isn't much detail included, the instances of missing detail and patches of the paper's color seeping through also is detail within itself. It allows for a breath of fresh air between the characters and a depiction of their actions, especially if they happen to be within an environment. This is applied in two ways: form and color. Although mostly complete, there are breaths taken in Link's hair in his key art for Breath of the Wild's first expansion pass. Along with the motion of his hair that is explicitly shown thanks to the brushstrokes and lines headed towards the left, these breaths can also tell us the speed at which his hair is moving, providing another showcase of motion, and enhance the weight, or lack of, how thin is his hair that we could see what's behind him as it moves. This creates a unification of the character and the background, intertwining the two not just by depiction of action, but with the materials we use. When examining the use of color, we can see that Link's tunic isn't a solid shade of blue. It's made up of different hues, levels of saturation, and light that each take breaths and break apart amongst one another to establish both motion and the way that light affects the subject. While examining what we should do and can do to capture this art style, let's take note of the one thing that I believe we should never do: distract from the face. Yes, there are breaths between the color that is used for the face, but very rarely do we see the eyes distracted from. The eyes tell you about a person, what they're feeling, who they are. We must never take that away. At least that's what I believe, as the eyes are one of my favorite parts of the body. There are people that I haven't seen for about a decade, only able to remember them due to their eyes. Thus, we must never take a break when depicting their eyes. Finally, let's get to that final aspect of the brush: the shape of it. As I stated earlier, there is a sense of motion from the brushstrokes that is best shown in most, if not all, of the illustrations. But the best showcase of the brush is in the backgrounds of the solo character illustrations. From those abstract brushstrokes that somewhat capture the direction and motion of the subject, we can see that the brush isn't of a joined elliptical shape. Rather, it has a rectangular body with ends that thinly feather out. The tuft of it isn't symmetrical, as it seems to often have a diagonal angle to it, and the end of the bristles alternate from being thin or thick. Now that we're done with our analysis, it's time for the most difficult part of the process: creating the brush. In fact, you viewed the process of the brush's creation already, serving as the footage used between our analysis. But to specifically detail the creation of the brush is a lot harder to do in comparison to analyzing artwork that was already created. Instead of using Paint Tool side where there are preset brush shapes and textures that worked well for creating the original Breath of the Wild brushes, I'm using Clip Studio Paint, which features robust options for tool creation and customization, in part thanks to CPS's Asset Marketplace. Even without the marketplace, downloading brushes from other people gives access to their brush shapes and textures, which you could then use or examine, which is what I did. A large part of this Of the Wild brush set took inspiration from Pharan Brush's Tapioca pack. However, as I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to use someone else's assets that I specifically had to purchase, I took the route of creating my own. Well, somewhat. At first, I tried using the assets from Paint Tool side and bringing them into Clip Studio, which didn't work as planned. I tried recreating the size brush shapes for myself, and I still didn't get what I wanted. For a while, I was stuck, until I did more research about how to create your own brushes in Clip Studio Paint, which led me to this video: Create Custom Brushes in Clip Studio Paint by Scott Drummond. To give as fast a rundown as possible, I sampled my real-life pens and paintbrushes on a nice clean sheet of paper, scanned it, and turned their blots, marks, and presses into materials that would serve as the brush shapes. From there, I did some rotations, changing thickness, made different brushes for the different size and directions of the brush shapes. In fact, I kept all of these sampled materials that I used in the folder of the brush pack so that you could use for yourself. And here we are. The current brush set. Yes, current. As time goes on and with feedback that I love to hear from you all, I'm aiming to improve and update the Of the Wild brushes over time. Doing such a thing also prevents people needing to feel as if they have to buy or rebuy an entirely different listed product on Gumroad. So if you're looking to download or support this brush, either by downloading it for free or choosing to pay however much you want for it, you can access it from my Gumroad page down in the description. Additionally, I'll be linking my Ko-fi and new Patreon page if you'd like to continue supporting my work and receive requested artwork from myself if you're unable to purchase an entire commission. Thank you all so much for the support and numerous amounts of downloads of the previous Breath of the Wild brushes for both Paint Toolside and Photoshop. Although I have no intention of using them anymore myself, I will leave them up for people to download if those are still their artistic software of choice. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe for more videos in the future. And if you're watching this once Tears of the Kingdom is already out, I hope you're enjoying the new Zelda adventure.